On Times Now's Post-Corona Scenario series, we are joined by the host of The War Room, Pandemic, and one of the world's leading political strategists, and also chief strategic in the Trump administration of U.S. President Donald Trump. He served in the first 7 months of Trump's reign. Steve Bannon, welcome to Times Now. Welcome to India Upfront, the show I host. And I want to begin with asking you some questions related to the outbreak that we are witnessing around us. You have a very strong view on a call for accountability from those you believe are responsible for this outbreak. Could you share your misgivings with particular reference to China?
Yeah, let me be very specific about this. This is not about whether the Chinese have an offensive biological weapons program. This is not about whether the Chinese, something happened at this P4 lab, may have leaked out. This has to do specifically with the chain of title of events. The Chinese Communist Party understood very early on, right? This is no later than the last week of December of 2019 that they had human-to-human transmission and community spread in central China in the city of Wuhan. And we know this because the Free Republic of China and Taiwan notified the World Health Organization. A bunch of heroic doctors led by Dr. Li were on a WeChat group that were talking about this. The Chinese authorities took Dr. Li and his compatriots, tortured them, forced them to sign a confession saying they were rumor mongers, which in China means on your social credit score you become basically the lowest form of human life. Okay, they rescinded that later. They also lied to the World Health Organization, who did a terrible job of due diligence. But on the 12th of January, the World Health Organization put out from Geneva, after consultation with senior medical officials in China, that there was no human-to-human transmission. They followed that by a tweet on the 14th of January that said the senior medical ministers in China told them no human-to-human transmission. At the same time, they're in the White House signing the trade deal. They left the White House, and at that time, they already had planned back in Beijing to start to shut down and stop Lunar New Year, this massive travel. When they did not stop travel to India, to Japan, to the United States, to the rest of the world. In fact, in the United States, I think we had 400,000 innocent Chinese. The Chinese people did not know what was going on. Innocent Chinese come to the United States, particularly through JFK. So my point is, for 6 weeks at least, and I think we're going to find out Mr. Shankar went much earlier. For 6 weeks, the Chinese Communist Party at the highest levels in Beijing understood that they had a metastasizing pandemic in Wuhan, and they lied and held this information up. Okay, one last piece of damning evidence. We know, because we've checked the import records in China, that in the latter part of January, about the third week, the Chinese Communist Party decided to go to Europe, the United States, and Australia and vacuum up all the protective equipment that the doctors and nurses would need to use. They're the largest manufacturer in the world, yet they bought 2 billion masks. And why did they do that? Because they thought this pandemic would explode in China. They wanted, more importantly, later on, they wanted to be used as currency to make countries like India, Japan, the United States kowtow to them for this. They are absolutely guilty. There's not even any question about their guilt. And we have a study, one last thing, there's a study done by Southampton University in England by a Chinese doctor who said that if they had been truthful and honest in the last week of December of 2019, when they knew they had a pandemic, 95% of the deaths and 95% of the economic carnage would have been taken care of, would have been stopped. So 95% of the deaths and the economic carnage in India and South Africa and Europe and Italy and the United States is all laid at the door of the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing.
Well, let's examine the motive. Now, you say that there is a definitive plan behind all of this to attenuate world economies, to make them dependent on China in some way. What is to be gained? China has got so much ignominy coming its way. What's to be gained?
I'm not saying listen, I want to make sure very clearly. I am not saying this came from a biological weapons program, and I'm not even saying it came from the P4 lab. I'm saying if you just take the evidence on the facts of the ground, I happen to believe the international community now is investigating the P4 lab in Wuhan and the P2 lab. Those are high pathogen labs that research goes on for SARS. I happen to believe that we will ultimately find, because of their incompetence and mismanagement, remember, this is a biological Chernobyl. This is exactly what happened in Russia with the nuclear power program. Incompetence of the communist apparatus to manage, and then their first thing is to cover up and protect themselves. So I think eventually we'll find out where this came from. But my point is, even aside from that, they're guilty and they're responsible and they have to be held accountable. Now, look at what they've done since. And obviously, one of the problems we have, and even in India, you can see this on the medical, on the active pharmaceutical ingredients, on the medicines, on the PPE. Even a country like India, who used to be a big manufacturer of this, is still dependent upon the Chinese Communist Party for this. So they're using this now to their advantage. So I think the nations of the world have to understand this is not about the Chinese people. They are the biggest victims of this brutal totalitarian dictatorship. And the reason I have such fondness for India and fondness for Prime Minister Modi is the fact that in India, you have a country that has a democracy. As messy as it is sometimes, you're still a free people. And in China, you see what happens when you have a totalitarian dictatorship. This could never happen in a country like India, because you have, at the essence, a free people who at the ballot box can determine their destiny. And in China, you don't have that. You have a repressive totalitarian government that's no different. And this is what we have to face. They're no different than the Nazis in the 1930s. They're as arrogant, they're as cruel, and they have that much disregard for human life, and particularly for the life of their own citizens and the citizens of the world.
Okay, so we're talking about accountability here. What shape and form do you believe this accountability should take? What shape and what form?
Let's take India, for example. Look at all the economic carnage that's going to happen in India. People have to understand the world's capital markets right now, the world's oil markets are imploding because of this complete drop of aggregate demand. The world's capital markets are imploding. The Dow Jones Industrial Average right now on the futures may open down another 500, 600, 700 points. This is going to have this economic crisis that's been triggered by this, the financial crisis on top of that, a crisis of both liquidity and solvency, is going to have a direct impact in every citizen in India for the decade to come, okay? And none of this have to happen. Remember, 95% of it didn't have to happen, the deaths or the economic carnage, if they had just been responsible back in December. They have to pay essentially reparations. The Chinese Communist Party, I think they need to be stripped of their sovereign immunity immediately. And that countries like India, countries like Italy, Germany, the countries of the world that have been damaged by this, including the United States, the citizens have to go after the assets of the Chinese Communist Party. I think their assets have to be seized. I think they have to be sued in courts throughout the world. I think all the economics have to be a organized approach of how the Chinese Communist Party is going to pay reparations. In addition, I believe we're going to get to the point that one day in the not too distant future, we're going to have a Nuremberg-like trial in Wuhan, where the citizens of Wuhan stand in for mankind, and they're the jury to judge President Xi, Wan Xishan, and the other gangsters. And that's what they are. They're gangsters. The gangsters that run the Chinese Communist Party out of Beijing.
Let me ask you, is the world in a position to stand up to China? Trump is making big noises, but given the shape and form of the U.S. economy, which is virtually hypothecated to China at some levels, is this all just big campaign talk at the end of the day?
It's a great question. Here's what I would say. We don't have a choice. The Chinese Communist Party is exactly like the Nazis in the late 1930s, probably 1936, 37, 38. They're in a direct information war and economic war with the industrial democracies, with Japan, India, Western Europe, and the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Latin America. We don't have a choice. This has to be confronted now. We've seen what they will do to their own people. This is about the freedom of the Chinese people. The only way we can have a world that has peace and prosperity for everyone is to help the Chinese people free themselves. In doing that, we have to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable. Is it going to be easy? No, it's not going to be easy. This is why I was early on such a big fan of Modi. I said years ago on my radio show and on the pages of Breitbart when Modi first came along that he was the new Reagan. And now I say he was Trump before Trump. Modi understood that nations themselves have to stand up in this globalized world. It's not that we're not interconnected. We are interconnected. We know that. But you have to put your country first. You have to focus on your country and your countrymen. And I think Modi's shown this in this pandemic crisis. Those nations of the world have to come together and understand we're not going to be free. None of us are going to be free. And none of us are going to be prosperous, working class and middle class people, until the slaves of China are free. We have to assist the Chinese people in their freedom. And as uncomfortable as it is, as unpleasant as it is, and it's not going to be easy, because we've allowed them to build this inextricably linked manufacturing system where everything goes back to China. Okay? But we have to confront it. We don't have a choice. If we don't confront this today, in 10 years, all of it, Japan, India, the United States, Western Europe, will just be part of a network that's run out of a totalitarian dictatorship. And the world's capital markets don't mind that. You can't look to the City of London. You can't look to Wall Street for leadership. They're not leaders. They're followers. They will go anywhere their higher profit margins are. So obviously, if there's slave labor in China, they're going to choose that over free people in India. This is what we have to break. We have to break the gulag of the Chinese Communist Party. And this happened back with the Soviets. Chernobyl was what led to, with President Reagan and his war against the Soviet Union, that leadership, it was Chernobyl that was the triggering event. We now have our biological Chernobyl. Free men and women throughout the world have to unite to confront this and help the Chinese people for their freedom against their totalitarian masters.
Well, Mr. Bannon, even though we have deep ties, economic ties to China, India has stood up to China. The Modi administration has passed an order making it difficult for Chinese companies to take over stressed Indian companies. I don't know if you read about this in the last 24 hours. This order was passed. Many say this is a stance against the rules of globalization. What's your view on these?
I think Modi's a hero. I think Modi's a hero. I think Modi has stood up. I want this done in the United States. I think it has to be done in Europe. Because the predatory nature of Chinese capital is to basically go through the reverse, like the British East India Company, which you guys know so well, use predatory capitalism, right, to basically to incentivize elites. Predatory capitalism you can't pay back. That's exactly what they're doing today. Modi understands history, and that's why Modi's been a leader in this. Modi stood up to them, and I admire him. This is one of the reasons I admire him so much. He stood up to them. Where so many other elites in the world could be bought off, he can't be bought off. And he's a symbol for the world. And I would hope that the United States follows his lead and we follow it quickly.
Well, let me just come back to the question, because many people are critical of the move that has been made by Mr. Modi. When he decided to step out of RCEP, they said that this was suicidal. India cannot exist outside the globalized value chains, the production lines, the just-in-time supply lines that China has enabled. Many people said that he was going against the architecture of globalization. Why do you believe that Modi is right in doing so?
Because he's not selling the Indian people into a system of slavery. He was a hero in doing that. And he's got the long-term view. It's going to be tough to do, but it's the right thing to do. What Modi understands is that India is the world's largest democracy, and quite frankly, I think a model for the world, right, of governance. And the way that you've taken a very, disparate population and you have a democracy, as messy as it seems sometimes, right? But it's allowing the voice of the little guy to be heard. And what Modi's saying from a nationalist point of view, he's not saying we're not inextricably linked in a globalized world economy. But you have to do that in looking at the nation state and looking at the nation and what's the best for the people in the nation. His ideas are what the future is. That's what's going to work out. The Chinese system is going to collapse. It's going to collapse because the money in London and New York City made a deal with the devil, okay? And eventually the devil overreached, and it was incompetent and cruel and didn't care about its own people. It's going to collapse from within. That's inevitable. The only question we have before us today is, do we unite as free people and help force the Chinese people in their own move to freedom to take down this group of gangsters? Modi was absolutely correct. He got a lot of criticism, but it's the best for India. It's the best for the Indian people. It's the best for the Indian economy. And most importantly, from where I sit, it's the best for the world.
Well, if you have to pull down the CCP, as you're saying, then many countries need to come together. Now, Donald Trump has decided to temporarily suspend immigration to the United States with the intention to fight what he calls as the invisible enemy. This hurts us, allies like India, more. Is this a wise decision going down the road?
Look, I'm very honored to be the chairman of the Republican Hindu Coalition, and I've worked very closely with the Democrats and the moderates to put on the Howdy Modi event here in the United States, which people should know was an absolute historic event. So our bonds with India and the rest of the world are very, very tight. I think what President Trump is doing, and this is because it's an emergency, right now, and if you look here in the United States, people should know in India, the response of our immigrant brothers and sisters from India have been amazing. The Indian doctors, the Indian nurses, they have been at the front line of fighting this. Has been absolutely incredible. So it's not, we know that our whole point, and I'm a nationalist, is that you have to have an immigration program that works, and you have to take care of your own citizens first. We can't have unlimited immigration. What President Trump, I think, has done overnight is that this is an emergency measure, and here's why. Is that because we have some of the most open immigration in the world, and it's been beneficial to us when done in an ordered process. What you're seeing is that we now have 22 million people unemployed. We are shedding 1 million jobs a day right now. And I think what the president's doing is that until we bridge this gap, this chasm, right, until we get the country back open, and that means really getting this virus under control, which we're just at the very beginning stages of, right? Until we do that, with shedding 1 million jobs a day, we just have to take a time out. This is not so much about the virus getting in here more. This is simply about we've got to get a handle on exactly what the unemployment is going to be, because we could very easily, and this projected out, we could very easily be at 30, 35 million unemployed here in the next 30 to 60 days. That is going to put a huge, massive stress on the American financial system. I think what President Trump did was correct, to take a time out and let's get sorted on what we're doing, understanding that many of the heroes we see every day on TV are immigrants that have come over here, particularly immigrants that have come over here and have actively participated and added into the healthcare system as doctors, nurses, and researchers at our top universities.
Now, do you see many more countries viewing China with greater suspicion as time passes? And what implications does that have for the world order as we have come to see it, Mr. Bannon?
It's going to totally change the world order. Everybody, look, I do talks or do interviews every day now throughout the world. All the leaders of the world understand what happened here. They understand what happened in China, and they understand how irresponsible they've been. It's just the courage to come together. It's very similar to the 1930s. Everybody knew Hitler was a monster, right? But nobody had the courage to come together and confront him when he could be confronted. So if you see the nations of the world, the Modi government, they absolutely understand. They understand to the marrow of their bones how evil the Chinese Communist Party is. So does Japan. So do our allies in Australia and around the South China Sea, in Western Europe. You see the brutality of what they're doing in sub-Saharan Africa. That's not even a question. The question is, do we have the moral courage to come together and do that? And that's what we're going to find out. Look, I obviously am a super hawk. I've been saying this for many, many, many years, that this confrontation has to come, or a day like this would be upon us. Look at India for a second. Coming through, these economic tough times, trying to get a growth economy, trying to build India. You just had an election where more people in history voted than anywhere else in the world, anywhere else on the planet, that you're free men and women that choose your own destiny, your own fate. Now you're looking at economic carnage, which had nothing to do with any citizen in India. It had to do with Beijing. It had to do with the Chinese Communist Party. This has happened throughout the world. And the people of the world, it's not the leaders, it's the people of the world have to unite and say, we cannot let this continue, because we're going to be the ones that always gets dumped down on. It is everybody united together to free our Chinese brothers and sisters. Once that takes place, and the regime in Beijing is done away with, and they have to stand trial for their crimes against humanity, then the world will be able to see the sunlit uplands.
So you're saying that we need a new coalition of the willing, so to speak. Who do you think is going to sign up for this coalition in the near future?
Here's what I think is going to sign up. I think you'll see Japan. I think you'll see South Korea, the countries around the littoral countries around the South China Sea, Australia, India, the United States, Western Europe. Look, to be brutally frank, the most important countries I think in this are Japan, India, the United States, the United Kingdom, maybe Brazil. Okay? That's the new coalition to confront the Chinese Communist Party, obviously with Germany and France and the rest of Europe. This is why India is the key that picks the lock. India is the most important. That's why this whole Indo-Pacific strategy. But now India takes its rightful place as really the central part of this strategy to kind of basically stop the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing from controlling the Eurasian landmass. That's clearly what they're trying to do. They're trying to use One Belt, One Road, just, made in China 2025, the Huawei rollout, this predatory capitalism of the old British East India Company model they're using. They're using that. India can see it every day. Modi sees it. That's where they've tried to thwart it. Now it's come. Now we see what the plan is. The plan is to control the Eurasian landmass, and by doing that, become a hegemonic power, and then to basically have their power throughout the world, throughout sub-Saharan Africa, Western Europe, the Caribbean, and eventually encircle the United States. It's quite obvious of what they're doing. And this is why the free men and women in India, to me, become the bulwark of democracy, the bulwark of free men and women that stand up to this.
Well, you certainly haven't held back, Steve Bannon. Thank you very much for speaking to Times Now and India Upfront. Let's hope we can meet up and do more of these conversations. Thank you very much.
Anytime. Great honor to be on your show. Thank you.